We have none other than architect Arjun Malik from Malik Architecture joining us on stage. Could we have a round of applause, ladies and gentlemen?
Hi, good evening, everyone. Um, I'm going to be talking about something that we don't do a lot of, frankly. I think for those of you who are familiar with our work, tends to be a lot of greenfield work, some sort of historic preservation and adaptive reuse. This is the headquarters for the Boston Consulting Group in Bombay. It's actually just right next door to where we are at Maker Mac City, which is an existing complex of 5 buildings. And this is actually an interior retrofit project. I'm not going to take too much time in terms of introducing. That's literally the site 2 minutes from here. Tower 2, there are 5 towers. This is Tower 2. Now, I don't know what you know about consulting companies, but in the case of BCG, they're one of the blue chip consulting companies. They decided to take about 65,000 square feet of space. So it's not a complete building. They haven't got complete floors. They've got 6 levels, 4 of them half floors, 2 of them complete floors, right? So you'd normally expect, because what they do anywhere else in India, if they take these 2 or 3, 1 or 2 giant floor plates of about 100,000 square feet. Here they've taken something where all their area is split inside an existing building. And what's interesting about BCG is whilst they have a sense of how they want to organize their workspaces, they've developed something called a village, where instead of just lining up lots of workstations and cabins all over the place, they tend to create these self-contained silos of workspace, cabins, case team rooms, focus rooms, etc. So when you introduce this word village, right, for us, obviously from the subcontinent, that's a very strong echo of something that belongs deeply to the urban and social fabric of our country. Now, this was actually through, we got this commission through an invited design competition with 12 firms. And what BCG encourages you to do, they don't have a kind of global aesthetic. They encourage you to draw influences from the region or the city that you are. So they're kind of particular about their workflows, but they're very flexible with their aesthetic language. Now, we won this competition because we re-envisioned the space as an integrated campus. Right now, when we think about a campus, we think about low-rise architecture woven with landscape, with trees, G+1, etc. And suddenly you've got these multi-storied spaces, all of them separated by slabs. You've got this large 70,000 square foot space, but you can't really use it exactly like your own, because each time you go from floor to floor, you exit your office, you get back into a public elevator core. So what really begins to bind the space together or suture it to create that sense of an integrated campus? We started to work with archetypes. A lot of our work tends to draw from Indian planning archetypes. In this case, when you look at the floor plate, it's essentially 2 perfect squares joined by a central portion, essentially wrapping around a core in a C shape. So we looked at the idea of the mandala and just scooped out its center to form a courtyard. We began to explore ways of binding the space, right, of how to be able to bind it 3-dimensionally, how to create an integrated, interconnected campus, and we simply reached back to the ideas of the Boweries and the Kunds to provide us some sort of geometric guidance as to how we could physically scoop out and stereotomically excise space from this structure. And just by combining the idea of the mandala with the center scooped out and the Bowery, we found these really nice 3-dimensional diagrams that would allow us to cut away through parts of the building and start to interconnect it. And the last thing that we drew on was the idea of the street. Now, when we talk about the street, again, from a sociological, daily life perspective in India, the richness of the street in terms of its narrowing, its expanding, the ability to form little nooks, patios, things that organically and vibrantly connect different functions. It's again something that we brought in so that instead of seeing typical corridors with lots of workstations and then cabins on the periphery, you start to organically use the plan through the idea of the expanding and contracting street. You start to use the stepwells in terms of three-dimensional connections. You start to use the cutaway courts, and suddenly this building, which is essentially nothing but a series of slabs with zero connections between them, just by strategically scooping out a few spaces, you start to create this beautiful interconnected labyrinth of space which binds all of their communal activities. Now, from a daily perspective, you can imagine instead of entering a building, getting into an elevator core, going up to the 4th floor, and then each time you have to connect to the 2nd or 1st or ground, you come back into an elevator core. Now, you can seamlessly move through this building, and because, even though it is 6 levels, because the street, or the three-dimensional street, is organized in a way that you have the barista, the cafe and work lounge, the amphitheater, town hall, different kind of gathering spaces interspersed along this labyrinth, it doesn't feel like a consistent 4 or 5 floor walk. And in terms of some of the geometries, again, you can see to the left, there is this chimney form, right? Now, when we talk about workspaces for consulting companies, I think in a way similar to tech companies, there is this sort of pervasive aesthetic that you find that talks about the language of open collaborative space, right? We see lots of color, we see lots of materials. We began to ask a counter question, that whilst you have all the open spaces for collaboration, what happens to the question of silence or solitude or the individual evolution, which then leads to the collective? So there are certain ideas, materials, and forms that draw from Bombay's industrial past, like the chimney, but we tend to think of it more as the idea of a well, the kuan. Obviously, when you're getting into a place like BKC with completely insane real estate rates, you have to go through a lot of technical analysis to understand how much floor space you're actually cutting away in order to enable this three-dimensional connectivity. So multiple exercises in terms of showing them that with very strategic excisions from the structure, you are actually able to build this connectivity. Obviously, from a structural design perspective, it can be quite taxing in terms of cutting away and then retrofitting. And in this case, the landlord also wanted a scheme to be able to reinsert those floors once they kind of left the building. So that's the final interconnected labyrinth. They have their, on the left, which is the only part which really accesses the ground and one's the significant cut through that binds a lot of their visitor interactive space, some of their multi-purpose rooms. And you can see the way that the diagonal street starts to move up. It cuts back down because there are parts of the floors which aren't even directly connected through the core. Essentially, I think it's about trying to take in a way, a nostalgic or a greenfield idea of the campus and finding a way to translate it through the excision of an existing structure. I won't spend too much time on the way the floors are organized, but you have the ground and one where they hold a lot of their multi-purpose rooms, large meeting rooms, board rooms, digital ventures rooms, tech space. And you can see the kind of figure ground diagrams of even the typical floors with space that weaves through rather than having continuous linear corridors. So your entire experience of moving either vertically, diagonally, or horizontally across a space has this sense and the density and the diversity of the Indian street. You can see some of the platonic forms, smaller physical modules of phone booths or focus rooms. It allows space to bend. It starts to give a certain physical dimension to that street, which then opens up into larger workspaces. And as you enter, that's kind of the sense of space that you get. We've cut away a central grid. You've got an 8-meter tall space. You've got this beautiful interpretation of a chimney that just comes and hovers above the ground. The material language is not typically corporate consultant's office. We've worked a lot with lime plasters. We've worked a lot with brick. We've worked a lot with natural stone. And this chimney, well, at least BCG calls it the chimney. We call it the well. And as you start to move through the space, you kind of get this sense of reverberation, this sense of kind of quieting down from the outside chaos. In a way, it's trying to take a particular type of building, trying to take a particular type of program, and trying to kind of interpret new ways to be able to deal with what is essentially a corporate or consultant's program through architectural strategies deriving from the region, through materials that derive through the region. Now, it's normally quite easy to do this when you look at greenfield architecture and you build from scratch. But to come into a structure and then start to cut away both from an engineering perspective, as well as the limitations of building within a short timeline with working offices. And yeah, there's a really nice sense of the oculus and the skylight and the kind of deep absorption and immersion of the well, the way that you start to experience space and you move up. And even as you move to the first level, the relationship between the walls, the materials, some of these suspended forms, the in-between spaces, the way that thickness is expressed, the way that openings are cut away from thickness, it all alludes to a type of architecture that maybe doesn't even belong in a space like this. Some of their workrooms on the ground floor, they are dealing with very, very sensitive content, so they need to be able to create a lot of privacy, so the ability to use some of their writing surfaces, to open, to close, to be able to bring the landscape in and shut it out when required. Some of the interior, the larger rooms, the boardroom. And as you move up to the second level, which is where most people tend to enter the office from the elevator, this is where they have their town hall, their amphitheater, their barista, and their work lounges. So part of the diagonal movement through the space also happens through actual large usable functions. So you don't feel like you're climbing this stairway to nowhere. It's the sense of moving and then stopping and experiencing, interacting, and then continuing your journey upwards. And you get very nice kind of spaces between these, under these stairs. Again, trying to work more with simple natural materials. The contractors absolutely hate us because they just love making their stuff in a factory and assembling it on site. The moment you tell a contractor to work with a material as simple as brick, they don't know what to do with it. So that's the amphitheater looking back towards there. So you also begin to activate different spaces. You can have a town hall. You can activate 4 different spaces for a town hall, so you can have 500 people in there at the same time. Basically, you're looking at this organism cut and sliced through an existing building that enables a completely different type of workflow in a kind of space that you would normally have seen in a greenfield campus. That's their cafe work lounge. They tend to use it 24/7 because it's used for meals only thrice a day, but otherwise. So it's interesting because if they are designing an office for 1,000 people, they only give you 500 usable spaces. So every single space in the building tends to get activated for use. As you start to move into the typical levels, you start to see the central slices through space, and sometimes they turn into staircases. Sometimes as they widen, they turn into meeting rooms. So yeah, I think in short, it's not, again, I said, normally we'd be talking about one of our greenfield architectural projects, but we found that this was an interesting opportunity to look at a different type of space within an existing building and see if we can take some of the ideas that really anchor our practice and be able to translate them into a far more constrained program. Thank you.